People do you think were raped on October 7th?
Approximately zero. A lot of the dead civilians were dead because they were targeted by the Israeli army.
Why don't you actually ask me my opinions about things instead of putting words in my mouth or arguing with people you imagine in your head? Are you saying that I believe that because my grandfather was Jewish? Is that what you're trying to say?
And the reason for that is just identity bias. It's just, this is what
Which identity?
In the West.
Which identity?
I don't know and I don't care. It's just identity.
Well, no. You can't say it's identity bias and then say I don't know. How is that anything to do with identity? Unless you're suggesting that my identity means that I have a particular view of this conflict.
Yeah, your identity gives you a bias towards this conflict, and that makes you...
What is the identity element that gives me a bias?
I don't know what your identity is. I didn't even know.
Really? Now this setting is fascinating.
Hello and welcome to the Bitcoin Standard Podcast. Our guest today is Konstantin Kisin. Konstantin is a comedian, podcaster, commentator, and all-around internet muckraker who hosts the Triggernometry podcast. A few years ago, he hosted me on his podcast to discuss my work on Bitcoin. A few weeks ago, him and I got into a cordial conversation on Twitter on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Believe it or not, such a thing is possible. And I asked him to discuss this in more detail on my podcast, and he graciously agreed. So, Konstantin, thanks so much for joining.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
All right. So, in general, I wanted to discuss the tweet that you mentioned, but in general, I think there is an interesting conversation to be had about the discourse around the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I think you offer a good perspective of how a lot of people in the West look at this conflict and how they view it. And I thought it might be good to give you the perspective of somebody who's actually from there. I grew up in Ramallah. I grew up under Israeli occupation. And so I have a slightly different perspective from the one that you're probably more familiar with. So I'd say, let me just begin with a general question. From looking at your tweets and your discussions of this topic, it's pretty clear that you are a Zionist. You would identify as a Zionist. So I guess my first question would be, why are you a Zionist?
Well, I don't know how you reach that conclusion. I suppose it depends on what you mean by Zionist.
Yeah, well, for me, a Zionist is somebody who believes that there should be a Jewish state in Palestine. Okay,
so I don't know if you maybe want to bring our audience up to speed in terms of the conversation we had on Twitter. I think one of the things I've always been very keen to emphasize is that anything I think or say about it, and I really haven't said very much about this issue in public at all, is coming from a place of not really being an expert and not really knowing about the history of it. That's not to say I don't know about the history of it, but when I speak about it in public, I'm really talking from trying to think through from first principles what people are saying about it now, right? So in terms of me being or not being a Zionist, I actually don't know that that is my position. This gets me into hot water with a lot of people. I don't know that I believe there should be a Jewish state in Palestine. Should is an interesting word. I mean, I think people, I've yet to hear an argument about the creation of the state of Israel that makes me 100% convinced that it was all clean and white and pure in every way, and there's nothing wrong there, right? So then again, there'll be people who don't like me saying that, but that is the perspectives I've been exposed to. So it's messy. However, there is a state of Israel now. It is home to about 10 million people. And so unless we are prepared to see those people be deported or killed, then currently I believe that state should continue to exist, because just like in any other situation anywhere else in the world, we don't go back 70, 80 years and go, actually, let's redraw this map. When Vladimir Putin tried to do it, we're all against it, right? Even though he has, but it was what Adolf Hitler was doing too. So the claim that we should go back 70 years and redo the borders of a country because the way it was created wasn't quite right, I don't find particularly persuasive. But in terms of the conversation you and I were having, it was much more about, I think it was about October 7th and who should have done what and how people should have responded. And that's really where, for me at least, the focus is. So no, I have never described myself as a Zionist, and I don't know that I would fit your definition of what a Zionist is either.
Okay, well, let me just say that I think this is a good place to point out one important misunderstanding, which is that if you say that you're not a Zionist or that you oppose Zionists, it doesn't mean that you want the Jews who are in Palestine to leave or to die. There are 10 million citizens of the state of Israel, but there are about 15 million people who live in historic Palestine between the river and the sea. And on that land, about 7.5 million are Jewish and 7.5 are not. So they're all under Israeli sovereignty. They're all under Israeli control, whether it's in Gaza or the West Bank or Israeli citizens. And so within Israel's citizens, there's 2.5 million that are not Jewish. And so there's 7.5 million who are Jewish and 7.5 who are not. So it's half the population that is Jewish. And so it's, I think, far more accurate to say that being a Zionist means you want to kill and deport the 7.5 million people who are not Jewish than it is to say that being an anti-Zionist means that you want to deport and kill the Jews.
Okay, well, by that definition, I'm sorry to interrupt. I would really quibble even much more than I already have with your description of me as a Zionist. I certainly don't want to deport or kill people who are not Jews in that area. Why would you say that about me?
No, I'm not saying that about you, but I would say this is what the Zionist project has been. And this has been the case from the 1920s. It was very clear to Zionist leaders that initially the understanding in Europe for people who had never been to Palestine was that this is a land with no people, which we should take because we are a people with no land. And then once people started moving there, they realized, well, that's not accurate. Famously, one member, I think it was of the Zionist organization, who traveled to Palestine, and he wrote back saying, the bride is already married. There are people already here. That our plan doesn't make sense. And then by the 1920s, it became very clear to a lot of these leaders that there needs to be something done about these people. And either we're going to have to fight them, or we're going to have to kick them out, or we're going to have to convince their neighbors to take them. And that's been essentially the driver of the conflict from day one. The driver of the conflict is the fact that when the Zionist project really got off the ground, and that's thanks to you British people, 1917, Lord Balfour gave the Balfour Declaration to Lord Rothschild because Britain was broke in World War I and they needed money, and they wanted the Americans to come in. And so they wanted to, in order to entice the Americans to come in, they thought they could entice the Zionists in America by offering Palestine. And so at that point, about 3 to 5% of the population of Palestine was actually Jewish. And, there'd always been a Jewish population in Palestine since the Muslim conquest of Palestine in 637. So when the Romans took over, they expelled the Jews. When the Muslims kicked out the Roman leadership, they did not kick out the native population. This is a common misconception. It's not like Arabs came from Arabia and kicked out the people who were in Palestine. The people who were in Palestine stayed there. They were mostly Christian at that time. The Muslims let the Jews come back, and they were able to live in Palestine from 637 up until 1947 and 1948. And during that time, they could own property and they could live there. So there was never an issue of we need to get rid of the Jews or we need to get rid of other people. It was always understood that Muslims, Christians, and Jews had lived in that land and they all had their property rights. And under the Turkish system, there was something called the millet system, where every group had its own civil law determined by its own religion and its own religious authorities. So you can see why that would be a problem, why people like me might not be too excited about the idea that a 5% minority in your country, which is, I guess, probably around the same, I'm not sure about the numbers, but I guess this is about the percentage of Muslims in Britain at this point. Maybe 5% of Britain is Muslim. So imagine how it would feel like if somebody said, yeah, let's make Britain into a national homeland for Muslims. And now we're going to start encouraging Muslim migration into Britain. And also, we're going to take over land from people who are not Muslim and build institutions of the state that are geared toward making all this land owned by Muslims. And then we're going to get rid of all the rest of the population. So what I'm saying is that the problem with the support for Israel as the default position, and that this will get us into your tweet and our discussion, is that it just ignores all of that stuff and ignores the role that the Western powers have had in enforcing this and in making this reality come about, and then likes to pretend that history starts always at the point when any Palestinian fights back. And then that's portrayed as just a completely crazy, insane, violent, unjustified, monstrous, barbaric act that justifies any kind of response. And I think this is really what it comes down to. So if you look at your tweet, which started this discussion, you're saying, the thing very few people will openly say is that once you become a parent, if someone kidnaps your child and holds them for months on end in captivity, and you give exactly 0 Fs about how exactly they're returned, and the more of her captors are killed, the happier you'd be. That is a pretty brave defense of Hamas, I would say, on October 7th.
No, that's a funny point, except that's not what Hamas did. And this is, I think, the crucial distinction that never gets picked up in any of these conversations. So first of all, the history, I come back to my point originally, which is you are undoubtedly more knowledgeable about the history of that region. And I'm not really interested in going over that because, as I say right up front, it's not something that I know about. So I'm talking about conversations from first principles. Now, if we're talking from first principles, I still want to come back to this idea that you introduced me as someone from whose public discussions it is clear that I'm a Zionist, and then you define Zionism as being willing to deport and murder people, which I'm not offended, but I don't think that's an accurate representation of my beliefs. So I think that's an important thing for me to maybe just point out. But in terms of...
Well, that did get too contentious, right? Although I think Konstantin Kisin, underneath his skin a little bit, was getting slightly pissed that Saifuddin Ammous, was basically saying that by your tweet and by what you're talking about, seems to me, you're a Zionist. And Konstantin kept trying to say that, well, tell me what you feel by, how do you define Zionist? And this is what happens, folks, no matter what side of the argument you fall on. If you're Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, and you want to label somebody when you're talking about Israel, Palestine, Gaza, West Bank, the entire Mideast conflict. When you look at your political deck, I talk about a political deck of playing cards. Every group has them, and there's a number of cards in there. And so like in the United States, you're the Democrats, when you want to get somebody or you wanted to really hurt somebody politically, and you want to outmaneuver them, from the left, well, you reached into that playing deck and you tossed one out and it had the R on it and you were being called a racist. And going back probably about a decade ago or longer, that was very effective. It shut down discussion real quick because nobody wanted to be called a racist. And the Democrats used that effectively. Throw out the B card. Bigot. You're a bigot. Very effective for a while. Now, what did they do? That's sort of now they've been throwing that card out so much, that it's kind of dinged, torn up. Can't really see the R anymore. Can't see the B anymore. Not effective anymore. But got a new one, J6th. Throw out the I card. Insurrectionist. Oh, got me there. Insurrectionist. I guess I'll just shut up. Wrong. Just pisses people off even more now. Those political playing card decks aren't working. However, those on the Palestinian side, the Arab side, the Muslim side, well, their playing card deck when they go out there is what? The Z card. Zionist. Toss that out in the conversation. Call someone a Zionist. Stop them in their tracks. They don't want to be called that. And that's what sort of happens. So he starts out immediately, Saifuddin, trying to get right out of the gate, identifying the person that he's talking about, labeling them immediately, sort of trying to see, put them on the defensive so they can't go. And to Konstantin's credit, he basically says, look, I've never purported myself to be a historian of what's happened in the Mideast, what's happened, the creation of Israel, Palestine, the whole situation. But one thing he does say is that the genie is already out of the bottle, folks. No matter what you think, there's either, I guess there's solutions on the table. The question is that, are you on any of the extreme sides of the situation? Or are you trying to be somewhere in the middle? One extreme is absolutely get rid of the Palestinians. The other thing is get rid of the Israelis. Get rid of the Jewish people. Get rid of the Muslim Palestinians, Christian. Get rid of all, just that's it. The other one could be a two-state solution. But in order to have those solutions, you have to have people willing to come to the table. The problem is that who's speaking for it used to be the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, under Yasser Arafat. That went nowhere. Then it went to the Palestinian Authority with Abbas. That went nowhere. Now you've got Hamas, the militant wing of the Palestinians, their protectors, and also instigators and terrorists in their own right. And then you've got the Jewish people, the Israeli state, America. The question becomes is, genie's out of the bottle. 47 was the creation of the nation state of Israel. Now you've got, as he mentioned, 10 people living inside Israel proper, 5 million outside, 2.5 million Palestinians within Israel proper, I think is what he was saying, 7.5 million Jews. So out of the entire population of 15 million, he's saying it's like half and half. Well, the whole idea is what? You're not trying to say that, 50% of the population has got to skedaddle and get out, and 50% of the other population on the other side either has to skedaddle and get out. Genie's out of the bottle. State of Israel, nation of Israel is there. Now we got to work on what we're going to do to see whether or not these two nations, these two peoples can live together. I don't know. I don't have answers to that. But the fact of the matter is, history only takes you so far. But if you keep bringing up history and keep going back, how do you proceed further in moving forward? That's a question to be answered, folks. Anyways, we appreciate you taking the time to watch. Hope you enjoyed this clip. It was a pretty long interview, discussion back and forth, so we've clipped it up into small pieces. So, look at our video links out there. Take a look at those. Should be here and here. My final thought is always, when you're right, you're right. And when you're left, you're wrong. Until next time, folks, take care and stay safe.